I'm Ash, and for this video, I'd like to give you a little summary about the philosopher and German idealist named Friedrich Hegel. So, from the previous discussions of the empiricists, the rationalists, and then to Kant's critical philosophy, we now transition to the German idealism, which occurred in the 19th century. Immanuel Kant had a significant impact on German thought in such a way that German idealists transformed Kant's critical philosophy to metaphysical idealism. Kant maintained that the true nature of things in themselves is permanently hidden from us, and that knowledge is possible from the categories that our minds impose on our experiences, or a priori experience. In other words, our minds already possess concepts prior to experience that we then employ in relation to objects, contrary to the empiricists who claim that we cannot obtain knowledge of anything without any prior experience or impression. Kant argued that metaphysics is impossible, that the human mind cannot achieve theoretical knowledge about all of reality, arguing that there is no way for our minds to grasp things in themselves, which dwell in the noumenal world, since our mental categories or capacity is only limited to the phenomenal world, or what our sense experience let us perceive. But for Friedrich Hegel, he argued that what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. He then concluded that everything that is knowable. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born at Stuttgart in 1770 and lived through Germany's most brilliant intellectual period. At an early age, Hegel was deeply impressed by ancient Greek writers, coming eventually to believe that Plato and Aristotle were not only the sources of philosophy, but even now its life-giving roots. Hegel pursued his interest in philosophy after leaving university. He then arrived at his philosophy of absolute mind. So first, let's define what is German idealism. So during his time, mind is the ultimate source and content of knowledge, not physical objects or some mysterious thing in itself. So according to Hegel, again, every reality is rational, and what is rational is real. If all objects of our knowledge are the products of mind, but not our minds, it must be assumed that they are the products of unintelligence other than that of a finite individual like you and I. Hegel and other idealists concluded that all object of knowledge, and therefore all objects, and indeed the whole universe, are the products of an absolute subject, an absolute mind, or in theological terms, simply God. But since Hegel is not inclined to discuss his philosophy in theological terms, he refers to this God as the absolute mind. If you would recall, Plato distinguished forms from things in his theory of forms. Hegel, unlike Plato, did not ascribe any independent existence to the categories. Instead, he said that they have existence and have their being independently of a person's mind or thought. Hegel wanted to say that the real world is more than the subjective conceptions of people's minds. At the same time, he was saying that reality is rationality or thought. There are two major points in Hegel's argument, and the first one is we must reject the notion of an unknowable thing in itself. And number two, the nature of reality is thought, rationality, and ultimate reality is the absolute idea. Let's discuss a bit about the nature of reality. Whereas Plato made a sharp distinction between appearance and reality, Hegel argued in effect that appearance is reality. He said nothing is unrelated. Every separate thing we experience will ultimately lead to other things that are related to it. Eventually, the process of dialectic thought will end in the knowledge of the absolute, or what is truly real, or again, God. Hegel described the absolute as a dynamic process, as an organism having parts but nevertheless unified into a complex system. The absolute is, therefore, not some entity separate from the world. Rather, it is the world when viewed in a special way. Hegel believed that the inner essence of the absolute could be reached by human reason because the absolute is revealed in nature as well as in the working of the human mind. What connects these three, the absolute, nature, and the mind, is thought itself. A person's way of thinking is, as it were, fixed by the structure of nature, by the way things actually behave. Let's go to logic and the dialectic process of Hegel and how he came up with such a process. It was Hegel's view that we can know the essence of reality by moving logically, step by step, and avoiding all self-contradiction along the way, much like René Descartes' methodic doubt and his method of using mathematics and logic to deduce the truth. But unlike Descartes, however, whose emphasis was on the relations of ideas to one another, Hegel argued that thought must follow the inner logic of reality itself, which can be found in the present and the actual, not anywhere beyond what we cannot touch or access. Logic, then, is the process by which we deduce from our experiences of the actual the categories that describe the absolute. This process of deduction is at the very heart of Hegel's dialectic philosophy. Hegel's dialectic process exhibits a triadic, as in three, triadic movement, namely from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. The synthesis then becomes a new thesis, and this process continues on like a cycle until it ends in the absolute idea. What Hegel emphasized in his dialectic logic was that thought moves. Contradiction does not bring knowledge to a halt, but instead acts as a positive moving force in human reasoning. So if you are thinking as a human, if you come to a contradiction in your mind in trying to make sense of something, it shouldn't stop you from thinking beyond the contradiction. So thought moves from the contradiction and ultimately finds a new way to make the new thesis into an antithesis and into synthesis eventually. This movement of thought is from the more general and abstract, from the bigger picture, to the more specific and concrete concept, the smaller. It's from bigger picture to the smaller picture. In Hegel's logic, the antithesis is always deduced from the thesis. So the thesis always comes first because it is already contained in the thesis, the antithesis. Becoming, Hegel says, is the unity of being and nothing. Being as the thesis, nothing as the antithesis, and when united together, it forms the synthesis of becoming. Now let's discuss Hegel's philosophy of nature. From the idea, we derive the realm of nature. As Hegel puts it, nature represents idea outside itself. Dialectically speaking, nature is the antithesis of idea, which is the thesis. The concept of nature leads our thought finally to a synthesis represented by the unity of idea and nature in the new concept of spirit or Geist, which translates to either spirit or mind. So from the thesis of the idea, comes the antithesis nature, and when combined together or when they unite together, they form the synthesis of spirit. Nature is the realm of necessity, whereas spirit is freedom. Nature, Hegel says, is to be considered as a system of stages, of which one proceeds necessarily from the other. That's why it's called necessity. Freedom, on the other hand, is the act of spirit. There is then a dialectic opposition. So they are opposing each other, spirit and nature, one of freedom and the other of necessity. Moving on to Hegel's philosophy of spirit, Hegel sets forth the elements of his dialectic, in which the thesis is subjective spirit, the antithesis is objective spirit, and the synthesis is absolute spirit. He goes on to illustrate that the absolute is spirit, and that this spirit finds its manifestation in the minds of individuals, in the social institutions of family, civil society, and the state, and finally in art, religion, and philosophy. The subjective spirit refers to the inner workings of the human mind, whereas the objective spirit represents the mind in its external embodiment in the social and political institutions. At the apex of knowledge are art, religion, and philosophy, which are the achievement of absolute spirit. Next, we have Hegel's ethics and politics, and the first concept we will talk about is the concept of right. So individuals express freedom most concretely by an act of will. Hegel looked upon will and reason as virtually synonymous, saying that only as thinking intelligence, will is free will. We express freedom chiefly in relation to material things, appropriating them, using them, and exchanging them. Because material things are not self-complete and don't have a purpose of their own, we can impose our will upon them through appropriation. A concrete example of how individuals make use of their will or free will in the modern world in the appropriation of material things or material objects or property is through contract. And Hegel defines a contract as the product of two free wills agreeing to exchange property. Insofar as individual people act rationally, our free acts conform to the rationality of the universe. Our individual wills harmonize with the universal will. Among free people, the harmony of wills is precarious. Thus, there is always the possibility of the opposite of right, which is the negation of right, exemplified in violence and fraud, or more commonly known to us as the wrong. Okay, and wrong consists in the breakdown of harmony between a person's individual will and the universal will. The dialectic relation between right and wrong produces the tension between the way the wrong will acts and the way the will should act in order to be universal, that is, rational. This tension or conflict between right and wrong is what gives rise to morality. For Hegel, the essence of morality is found internally in a person's intention and purpose. Moral responsibility then begins with those acts that can be assigned to a free will or a will that intends the act. Moral duty derives from the requirement of identifying a person's individual will with the universal will. Morality is, therefore, an element in the dialectic process. The thesis is the abstract right of each individual, and the antithesis is morality, for morality represents the duties that the universal will raises as limitations to the individual will. The relation between these two wills is the relation between freedom and duty, subjectivity and objectivity. In this regard, Hegel described the good as the realization of freedom, the absolute final purpose of the world. So Hegel maintains that an individual can only do good when an individual performs his or her duty to society with a will that conforms to the universal will.